German soldiers captured in North Africa, France, or Italy braced for a grim fate, shaped by Nazi propaganda that promised forced labor, beatings, starvation, and humiliation in enemy hands. As they surrendered, disarmed, and marched into captivity, their imaginations conjured dark futures. Yet, the American soldiers surprised them with unexpected kindness, offering cigarettes, water, even a joke or two. Wary of a trap, the prisoners remained cautious, expecting cruelty to surface later. The journey to America defied their fears. Instead of filthy, cramped cattle cars, they boarded ships or trains with decent food, white bread, meat, coffee, and space to rest. For men accustomed to wartime scarcity, this was baffling. They whispered among themselves, "Why feed the enemy so well? Was this a ploy to keep them fit for brutal labor or sinister experiments?" Suspicion lingered as they crossed the Atlantic, staring at an ocean that separated them from home. These soldiers, trained to see themselves as warriors of a 1,000-year Reich, now faced an uncertain future as captives in a land they'd only known through propaganda, a distant powerhouse of skyscrapers, jazz, and Hollywood. Arriving in America, the sheer scale of its harbors, cities, and factories stunned them, underscoring the Reich's dwindling resources. Inland, they saw vast fields, endless highways, and small towns with neon signs. Locals, including children waving at convoys, showed curiosity rather than hatred. Unsettling men braced for hostility. The POW camps were another shock. Clean barracks, mess halls, medical stations, and recreation areas replaced the squalid prisons they'd expected. Meals, meatloaf, potatoes, beans, even fruit astounded them. Men who'd survived on black bread and thin broth feared the food was drugged, but hunger won out, turning disbelief into quiet gratitude. Camp life settled into a routine that defied expectations. Roll calls were strict, but not brutal. Guards carried rifles, but often chatted casually. Red Cross packages brought soap, toothpaste, and writing materials, and censored letters reconnected prisoners to families. Discipline existed. Escape attempts led to confinement, but lacked the cruelty they'd anticipated. In rural America, through camp fences, they saw farmlands and small towns. Some prisoners worked on nearby farms, treated more like laborers than enemies. Civilians showed indifference, not malice, and children sometimes waved, leaving the Germans bewildered by this casual normalcy. The greatest surprise came with entertainment. Soccer fields, chessboards, and even small orchestras appeared in camps, but nothing stunned them more than movie screenings. In makeshift theaters, white sheets became screens for Hollywood films, comedies, westerns, musicals. For men raised on rigid Nazi propaganda, these vibrant stories were a revelation. Charlie Chaplin's antics and John Wayne's heroics drew laughter and awe, making prisoners forget their captivity for a few hours. Newsreels, showing America's industrial might, highlighted the Reich's inevitable defeat, yet the screenings were voluntary, and halls filled quickly as word spread of another Western or a comedy tonight. These films did more than entertain. Comedies celebrating underdogs and Westerns glorifying justice challenged Nazi ideology. Romances with confident women and casual freedom clashed with the rigid gender roles of the Reich. Prisoners debated these values, questioning the propaganda that painted America as decadent and weak. For younger soldiers, Hollywood's heroism rooted in individuality, not obedience, was intoxicating. They memorized lines, imitated actors, and scribbled names like Clark Gable in notebooks. Letters home, though censored, hinted at these strange entertainments that softened the edges of captivity. Families in war-torn Germany, surviving on ration cards, struggled to imagine their sons laughing at American films. The screening sparked deeper shifts. The hostility of new arrivals faded as they watched films portraying ordinary Americans with dreams and dignity. A comedy mocking authority or a musical bursting with energy contradicted the Reich's portrayal of a barbaric enemy. Some prisoners whispered, "If this is propaganda, it's the most beautiful kind." Others began to suspect it wasn't propaganda at all, just a glimpse of how Americans lived. These images of supermarkets overflowing, workers laughing, music-filling dance halls stood in stark contrast to Germany's bombed-out cities. For men taught to see the Reich as civilization's pinnacle, the films planted doubts that grew in quiet barracks conversations. As the war ended, repatriation loomed. Returning to a devastated Germany, prisoners carried memories of abundant food, soccer matches, and movie nights. On ships crossing the Atlantic, they spoke in hushed tones about what they'd miss. "No one back home will believe it," one said. "How do we explain laughing at comedies while our cities burned?" The dilemma was real. Speaking of camp life, risked disbelief or accusations of disloyalty. Yet stories spread. In German villages, former prisoners described nights watching Ginger Rogers dance or cowboys gallop across plains. Families, struggling to rebuild, found these accounts surreal, almost fantastical. For many, the screenings reshaped their worldview. The simple dichotomy of a noble Reich versus evil allies crumbled. They'd seen America's culture, its humor, creativity, and vitality, not through rifle sights, but through a projector's glow. Years later, as American culture flowed into post-war Germany, former prisoners became unintentional ambassadors, sharing tales of Hollywood behind barbed wire. Some admitted those films sparked an openness to Western ideals, sowing seeds that sprouted in a new, democratic West Germany. Decades later, veterans still marveled at the paradox. We were the enemy, they'd say, and they let us watch movies. To them, it symbolized America's confidence, a nation so powerful it could entertain its captives. More than distraction, those cinema nights offered a reprieve from war's weight, a glimpse of a freer world. The glow of the screen lingered as a quiet legacy, proof that even in captivity, stories could plant seeds of peace, bridging divides no weapon could cross. The repatriation of German prisoners marked the end of their surreal chapter in American camps, but the impact of those cinema nights lingered far beyond the barbed wire. As they returned to a Germany scarred by defeat, cities reduced to rubble, families surviving on meager rations, the memories of Hollywood's glow contrasted sharply with the grim reality of Reconstruction. The prisoners, now former POWs, faced a world where their stories of captivity sounded like fables, telling loved ones about laughing at Charlie Chaplin or marveling at John Wayne while the right collapsed invited skepticism, even accusations of betrayal. Yet, in quiet moments, they shared these tales and the accounts spread, planting seeds of curiosity about the nation that had been their captor. In post-war Germany, the influence of American culture grew, fueled partly by these returning soldiers. The films they'd seen, bursting with humor, individuality, and dreams, became reference points for a generation rebuilding amid the ashes. Former prisoners, once loyal to the Reich, found themselves describing America not as a faceless enemy, but as a land of abundance and possibility. Some admitted privately that the screenings had cracked their worldview, challenging the Nazi propaganda that had shaped their youth. The open defiance of authority in comedies, the rugged heroism of westerns, and the vibrant freedom of musicals hinted at a society where people could question, create, and thrive ideas that resonated in a Germany groping toward democracy. As the years passed, the Marshall Plan rebuilt infrastructure, but the stories of cinema nights rebuilt imaginations. Former POWs became conduits for American culture, sharing tales of Hollywood's magic with younger Germans eager for hope. A farmer who'd watched a musical in a Texas camp might hum its tunes while working his fields. A mechanic, once a teenage soldier, might recount a comedy's punchline to his children, sparking laughter and questions about the distant land. These small acts wove American ideals into Germany's fabric, softening the edges of a nation once defined by rigid ideology. Veterans, reflecting decades later, still shook their heads in disbelief. We were their enemies, they'd say, yet they showed us their stories. The screening symbolized America's overwhelming confidence, a nation so secure it could share its culture with captives. But they were more than a display of power. The films offered a glimpse of humanity in the midst of war, a reminder that even enemies could share moments of laughter and wonder. Some former prisoners credited those nights with opening their minds to Western ideals, contributing to West Germany's alignment with the Allies. The projector's light, it seemed, had been a subtle tool of reconciliation, more powerful than any weapon. The legacy of those cinema nights endured in the stories passed down to children and grandchildren. A grandfather might describe sitting shoulder to shoulder with comrades, watching a flickering screen under the eyes of American guards, feeling the war fade for a few hours. These memories, etched as deeply as battlefield scars, carried a paradox. Men who fought for Hitler found humanity in the heart of their enemy's land. Historians interviewing these veterans noted how often the films came up, not the labor or the fences, but the laughter, the music, the escape. For many, those nights were a turning point, a moment when they began to see the world not through the lens of propaganda, but through the universal language of story. In time, the screenings became a quiet legend of the war, a testament to the power of culture to transcend conflict. The German POWs had entered America expecting cruelty and found instead a nation that fed their bodies and their imaginations. The glow of the movie screen flickering in rural camps had done more than entertain. It had planted seeds of understanding, hope, and change. Long after the war, as Germany rebuilt and reconciled with its past, those former prisoners carried a truth they could never forget. Even in the darkest times, a story could light the way toward peace.